Okay. Hi.
Hi, Pauline.
Hi.
So thank you again.
Yeah, I appreciate it too. You know, in between these times when we come together, there isn't a whole lot of, my confession is there isn't a whole lot of content associated with what is occurring for me. It's just simply conjunct with what is arising. And for me at the moment, that process is incredibly simplified. But because we have this connection, what becomes enlivened for me by having and enacting the relationship is everything to do with my relationship to beloved. So for that, I'm grateful. And naturally embedded in that relationship with beloved is such a profound consideration of everything that he's given over all of his life.
Yes.
Including, personal instruction, not just to me, but to you. And so therefore that's the basis on which I think these dialogues arise spontaneously. For example, you asked me this morning, did you have anything that you wanted to discuss? And I didn't really. I'll be honest, I didn't really. There wasn't anything in mind. But as I was feeling into what would be a useful consideration, because it has been, when I said maybe a few dialogues ago, I have all kinds of questions for beloved now. They are tangible, tactical questions relative to the challenges associated with his work, or what I understand his work to be in and via these forms of agency and instrumentality, the culture being one of them. So my question to you relative to that is, I never was in a position, for example, of being directly yelled at by beloved. Was I outside of a room where I could hear him shouting? Yes. Do I have a sensitivity of what the force was that he was conducting in his body that, just as you described in your Leela in the 1986 event, just flattened you to the floor? That's the force with which he was constantly bringing his shout down into this world. So I could feel it, even though I wasn't directly in the room. I was right outside the room. I could feel that. And I've heard and seen even Ruchira Dhammanati Kanta flat on the floor like that, listening to him for hours, shouting. So my question to you is about that reality, because it is a very unique position to be in a situation where you're communicating directly with the master regarding something, and he is animating that side of his function as guru and being allowed to animate that fully. What was that like, and what are some of the realities associated with being such an instrument in that capacity?
Yes. Oh, big question.
Big question, yeah.
Really, really important one.
Yeah.
So when I hear you ask about his shout, obviously that's associated with his voice and the decibels at which he may communicate. And so in my feeling relationship to beloved and feeling the Leela of his incarnation and my history and the history of those of us who were most directly intimate with him. One thing about beloved as he manifested in every aspect of his being was that he was unleashed. Like there wasn't a strategy behind what he was doing, and there wasn't an agenda in the sense that it was associated with an ego act. Therefore, it wasn't reactivity. So understanding these distinctions really would require one to be in the recognition response asana in relationship to him, which he describes very specifically as being able to locate his state, the feeling of being, and that his nature, which is conscious light, the divine self position that is light itself, unqualified, which is the free force and the quality of his being is so alive, like fully alive, without any form of constriction in it. And therefore there's infinite energy, boundless, as he uses, are the words that you hear him confess about the nature of the feeling of being, of love, bliss, but not a bliss that has an opposite. It's not a conditional bliss or a conditional force. That light does get modified. So then you get the reverberations, you get the decibels, you get the qualities, you get the nuances, you get the subtleties, you get the sensation. You experience it in all different levels of your being. And that being the case, then it also depends upon the individual. Speaking for myself, then, for example, I would experience beloved's state of being and his love bliss and the reverberations of that in a way depending upon this receptacle. And to put it in perspective, when I first arrived, his shout, the first experience that I had of his shout was actually seeing the impact of it on someone after the fact. Like, I didn't actually hear him, but I saw the force of his being communicated to Nina, who they had been intimates for a long time before I was aware of the quality and the nature and the history of their relationship, apart from what I read in The Knee of Listening. Mm-hmm. And knowing Nina, living with her for a very, very long time, but then the flip side of that, first being around her and not knowing her very well and not knowing her intimacy. When I saw her after she had told me that he was upset with her and he was shouting at her and he was dealing with her or working with her, reflecting things to her. What I saw in her was I could have put my hand through her. In other words, the force of whatever he was working within her, she became transparent. Like there was just the visual awareness that something significant had occurred in this being. I hadn't experienced that in terms of a shout. I had experienced that force in another way. So what I'm describing is that his shout was one aspect of his force, like the presence of his being, that is a penetrating force. It's an intervention. It can be sharp, and necessarily so, because there actually is a necessary severing or a discrimination or an intelligence that must be brought alive, that is countering the habitual mechanical force of the nature of egoity that has the force of Mother Nature. Mm-hmm. Okay, so and Beloved would communicate to us about crazy wise masters, or he would communicate about siddha gurus in certain traditions where there was an acceptance of this kind of force. And so in relationship to him and how he functioned, very early on, I studied. I was in the library. I was hearing him speak about the traditions. It was being put in perspective relative to the qualities, or what would be described as the siddhis, S-I-D-D-H-I, related to a spiritual master, a siddha, a true guru, a teacher that actually was taking an aspirant seriously. And the aspirant was saying, I'm here serious for you to work with me in the way that is necessary for me to be liberated. And the ones who were kind of closest around beloved, to be able, for him to be able to work with in that way, there was that consent. And there was there would be a dialogue with him in which those things would be agreed upon. And that occurred for me very early on with him, you know, that this acknowledgement that this relationship was something that I agreed to and took seriously and wanted to participate with him about. So I began to learn about the different qualities of his siddhis, the qualities of his divine person, of his presence, of his bodily human form, and they were all integrated. And one of the things that impressed me is, of course, his freedom. Like everything was unbounded in terms of his laughter. His laughter was a force, a force. His ability in terms of the way he moved bodily was a force. The way that his voice was animated in the qualities of it was a force. The way that he was intimate with the women that he was with was a force. It was, I mean, apart from the fact that the sexual act is penetrating in relationship to a man and a woman, everything that came from his body, from his presence, and the quality of his state of being as merely present, as conscious light, unqualified and absolutely still and wordless, that quality of being came into every motion that he manifested. For example, one time early on, I would say that the nature of my relationship with him was not so much about him being working with me as someone who actually had qualities that liked being yelled at, okay? Or being one that enjoyed a tussle, you know, or that was highly competitive in terms of combative. That wasn't the nature of my particular character. That didn't mean anything in terms of good or bad or right or wrong or qualitative, because that was another thing that I noticed. There were so many different people around, beloved. And looking at the men and the women that we were with day in and day out, he was surrounded by a lot of people. And then progressively, as time went on, the numbers that were actually around him most intimately slowly decreased until there were very few that he actually had in his intimate sphere. Everything became much more defined. And a lot of that had to do with his process itself in terms of his demonstration, but also had to do with what he was reflecting to us about a frustration, an upset, a despair, a sorrow, an acknowledgement about our continued inability to be able to respond in recognition and sufficiently to be able to act responsibly and show the signs that were required of our maturity, both individually and collectively, which you know very well about because you came at a later time. So you described a bit about what you experienced.
Well, I certainly only ever experienced, by the time I came in, it was like Ruchira Dhammakwanda Sukapur and Ruchira Dhammanadi Kanta were the two that were in the sannyasin order. And they were the two that he would communicate with. Over the course of those 8 years, increasingly, it became simply Ruchira Dhammakwanda Sukapur. So that in and of itself is a phenomenon that I observed, similar to what you were describing. I'm not entirely clear on why that is, or why that would have been a benefit to his work.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't. It wasn't, and I'll explain why. But go ahead.
I mean, one of the things that I feel has potentially become a myth is that Ruchira Sukapur was uniquely chosen, trained, qualified to be the only one, as if that's some kind of predestined thing, as if that was always something that there should have only ever been only one. And for me, I feel like there's tremendous liabilities in that, that have been allowed to play out.
Mm.
One of which, I mean, well, we can get into that, but it's a matter of function, really. It really is a matter, like, if I can envision, for example, some kind of speaker that has, those speakers that it's like on a pole, and you have one that's going out this way and one that's going out that way and one that's going out, and they're kind of like, but only one of those is working, then there's only one direction that's getting the message. It's kind of, it's only going in one point of view. Whereas Beloved's person is not being communicated in a kind of a 360 spherical shape.
Yes.
That would be represented by, all kinds of qualities, and they don't have to be at war with one another. They're not saying something different. They might just be communicating the same thing a different way.
Yeah.
That has value.
Yes.
There are many different types of beings in this world for whom Beloved spoke the same thing a million different ways. He created it in an artistic version. He created it in a literary version. He created it in a million different versions of the same communication from 1970s through using reality language in the post 2000s. So it appears that his message changed. He might have qualified that as cutting the fat. Fine. So he was cutting the fat, and he represented, even in his artistic process, as increasingly abstracted, something that becomes increasingly abstract. So in that sense, to comprehend that function in that context, okay, maybe he was so refined that he was only able then to, he was only able to handle the dissonance of one individual who he's having contact with. I don't know, but it is a phenomenon that is it's significant enough for me to notice one way or another what that represents.
Yeah. So the myth that is at the root of what you're speaking about is what is described as the last few years of his life, in which that was the time in which he was living the way he was supposed to, or that it was an indication of his choice, or that what was manifesting at that time was what he needed, or that he only, as if only what he spoke at that time is to be studied and to be seriously defining exactly the way, by virtue of what was occurring around him, that the culture should look at present. Those are complete myths.
Yeah.
And I'll describe why. When I indicated to you that over time it changed, it was always changing around him, and it had everything to do with those who were around him. Like I think I might have mentioned this before, but I asked him at one point, why are you upset all the time? What's so upsetting? Like, why are you upset with us? Even the question that you have is like, I mean, blood, sweat, and tears. We're here giving our all, and if we're not good enough, and I'm kind of paraphrasing my question exactly how I said it, but this is the emotion of the force, because I was frustrated too. And that it's like, yeah, it's like no matter what we do, it seems like it's not pleasing. And of course, one of the traditional admonitions is only do what pleases the guru. Now, that is a big samyama in and of itself. What pleases the guru? Well, what would please the guru is a recognition, a response, and an action that corresponds with the fundamental core yoga in the ability to be able to receive the gift that is being given. It's the reciprocation that is the nature of the relationship, so that the force of what the guru is giving can be received. The awakening occurs, the growth occurs, and then that is given over. That's given over. The guru is giving this gift and this transmission by Adidam's person, by his presence and his bodily human form, and in the form of all the treasures that manifested by virtue of his physical incarnation. So when I asked him this question, which I'm grateful that I was able to, not being afraid to ask that question. And I think it was probably indicative of the fact that I wasn't coming there expecting that there was going to be a shout at me, because he was strong with me, really strong with me, but I didn't get the same kind of shout that Sukumai did towards the end of his life. I was in the room at times when I heard that kind of thing, and there were times when he was upset with me, but it wasn't that kind of same play. It wasn't, and it was different with each person, and necessarily so. So when he said, his response to me in that moment is, in terms of my asking, well, why don't you get somebody else? Why us? And he said, because you were the ones who were given to me. So here's a Siddha guru that is, as he describes, his work was, he's merely present, in and as the bright, awake with the function of the Siddha master, the avataric Siddha master, which is a force of descent and a power of transmission. And he says he is spontaneously, synchronously, coincidentally, coinciding, all those words, intrinsically, inherently, spontaneously, creatively, artfully functioning in relationship to those who come into his sphere. And he trusts enough the process itself, by virtue of his whole life and up to that point, and being given this function, that whatever arises by virtue of recognition and whatever is given as a gift, is given to him to work with. So he's not doing research on the computer or going through, let's see, I want to see the resume of that person, or want to see the background of that person before, that pick them out over there and invite them into my company. No, it was free. It was a free event, a happening. So he said that you were who were given to me, and he takes that seriously. So all of the qualities of the universal manifestation of us as a collective were represented by the forces of the egoic individuals that came into his sphere. And all of us had different qualities that he had to work with, which we've spoken about, which he describes as the psychobiography of the ego. You have the gross, the subtle, and the causal aspects of any incarnate being. And all of that structure is manifested in the human form. So in our intimate relationship with him, he was working with each one of us uniquely. It didn't have anything to do with taking on secondary aspects of the discipline, that were supportive. The actual core of the yoga was being available vulnerably for the guru to work with you as a psychophysical entity, as a being, that is manifesting the liabilities of the ego act. And he spent so much time, which is what created this, the Dawn Horse Testament, in detail, in dialogue. These conversations happen with those of us intimate with him. I could tell you sections of this that occurred based on conversations with me personally that came into being as a result of this teaching. So it's not an abstract process. This, again, it wasn't like, oh, he's going to go study about certain traditions and select different parts of it and amalgamate it. This came out of the human relationship. Human, not abstract. No abstraction, no dissociation, unbounded participation, unqualified radiance of being in our relationship to him. And he was the reciprocation of our ability to be able to be in that yoga with him was what he needed to work with. That was fierce. And the fierceness and the power of it manifested in all qualities. In other words, he wasn't dramatizing a vital or a peculiar or a solid characteristic in his person. All of those qualities and all of whatever comprised his makeup in terms of the forerunners or the vehicles, or even his personality as Franklin Jones and as the New Yorker, which says fuck and shit and bullshit and, you know, the language is the street language. The characteristics of his passion, his fervor, his intelligence, you know, his no nonsense. Okay, you can call it whatever you want, but it was so attractive because of the freedom in it. And relative then to him working with the individuals, it's unbeknownst to any of us, and I know that so many people can say this, we can't account for how we landed there. We could if we want to, and it's fun to do. It's interesting to do. As sometimes we talk about, it's the forensics, you know, of the history of the relationship and the process. And it is informative. And it also, more importantly than anything else, these details grant, if they are rightly related to, serve the process of self-observation and self-understanding, because they psychophysically allow you to become cognitively aware in the conscious being, and at the feeling level, you can observe how these character qualities affect your energy and attention in relationship to him and the reciprocation process of the intimacy. And then you become aware of the knots. You become aware of the dramatization of egoity, okay? And his force, I'm saying, manifested in all the qualities, whether it appeared from a conventional point of view to be socially acceptable or not. Now, I'm saying that on all the years that I was with him, I could probably count on two hands the number of times where I went, whoa, that was way over the top. Like a kind of a sense like, yeah, like I got slapped in the bum, okay? A forceful slap in the bum. And like, okay, people have like a hawk eye and a magnifying glass on anybody who wants to presume an assumption and authority or be in the public eye, and for good reason, and they should be, need to evaluate the character qualities of these individuals. And this is what creates a lot of the controversies around what Beloved did, and also relates to your question relative to his shout. Yeah. Because I think a lot of people have been troubled by sometimes seeing and hearing his shout and seeing the force of his person in terms of how it manifested in different ways. I can tell you with absolute integrity, having been through the full spectrum of reaction on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ability to receive it in a right understanding of the nature of his function and an absolute trust in the integrity of his person. I've been through a process of being able to integrate all of that. that was probably the most fundamental necessity in terms of a right relationship to him and his function as guru. Not merely when he was in his physical body, but even more potently now, because the reverberations of his embodiment are still active in the whole bodily being, psychophysically, with those of us who are closest to him bodily, and also then reverberating out in terms of what you described as the mandala. You're describing the wheel. You're describing the links. You're describing the instrumentality of those who carry the responsibility of extending his force, extending his, what could be called his authority, the husbanding, the love bliss, all the qualities of the cities of his person were given over into vessels that are supposed to be able to conduct it properly. In order to do that, it requires all qualities, like all qualities. And you can't narrow it down to certain peculiar characteristics of a very small, minute vessel. Sukhumai is a minute vessel, even though she's an incredible powerhouse of a woman. And to be respected, to understand, to feel compassion, like any other individual human being deserves and requires, and to be enabled, to be served, to be cultivated, to make right use of. Is any of that happening in relationship to Sukhumai? Very little right now. And that to me is heartbreaking, because I love her, as so many people do, for her being one of the instruments that he's worked with, but she's not the only one. You see, and the way that it fell in terms of this myth of the last part of his life, I can't overemphasize enough that he was indicating he continued to live embodied after the divine translation in order to address the errors of what was going to happen after his Mahasamadhi. And these are the communications that are being hidden, as hundreds of people know. And as much as those who are assuming functions of ownership and control over his treasures, there's a whole lot that's being hidden to try to preserve the myth that what the structures are presently and the codes as they are, the manner in which they are being demonstrated is in correspondence with his precise instruction. That's not true. Hundreds of people know that, and the majority of people who know that are the ones who are the most intimate with him. And sadly, they are the ones who are not speaking up either about it. They speak amongst one another, as you know full well.
So there's a few different things I want to say about that, or ask about that. There was this, well, like I said to you in the beginning, there isn't much that occurs for me in the context of content, but when it does, you know, I respond. And one of the things that did come up recently was this acknowledgement of his use of the word action versus his use of the word actionlessness. Just in the context, well, even in the context of his writing in general, it is it's a profound revelation of him to study how his literature did evolve over the years. And that's something that I have constantly found myself having more and more insights about by observing the changes between various versions of the same text, for example. In any case, the Aletheon, which was written in those last few years of his life, referenced the word actionlessness hundreds of times. It appears in that text a phenomenal number of times, and it corresponds very much with his revelation of the perfect practice, or his development of the perfect practice in its fullness, which he had given even to beginners at that point. Like I came into his company, and that's when, well, I did, it's not 2005, 2006, that's when he gave this practice. It was coincident with, those last few years. So for me, it's integral to the process that I felt he was taking me through, even through gifting him all the colored glasses, for example, coincident with that. And his divine image art, for example, there was like a revelation of the spiritual transcendental process itself that he was revealing in those images that he was speaking to. So what I feel is that much of the gathering, the ones that you were speaking of, even in this last sentence where you said, hundreds that are remaining silent, when I have interfaced with many of these devotees, it appears to me that there is a cultural paradigm in which, like you said in the last time we talked, you are not the doer. That statement, you are not the doer, takes on a literal kind of force about it that undermines the capacity to do anything. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like, I feel that while at the same time, Beloved's own demonstration was replete with functioning. I mean, he did nothing but fun. Like he measured, talk about the word telemetry. You should just all look it up, look at the word telemetry. Beloved would record absolutely every detail of his life, every single day, and it would be measured day in and day out. Talk about devotional groups. And he did devotional groups on himself as a cottage with his doctors. He would be like, this is, you know what I mean? I mean, it was constant. Yes. The amount of observation and insight and change of action and yoga associated with that constant process that was happening in his own case, even though he was not the doer, it was self-evident.
Yes.
Yet somehow this, Beloved will take care of it. Beloved will handle everything. Well, yeah, he did all the worldly things associated with opening up a bookstore down on Melrose Avenue. I mean, he literally did that himself with his own blood, sweat, and tears. He did everything. And then even after 1986, he continued to consent to be involved with what was below the brows until he was not yogically enabled to do it. So that should be an example, an indication of what is actually required at the level of action, even while abiding in this divine actionlessness of non-identification as the doer. In any case, that entire, I mean, I can't even get somebody to acknowledge receipt of a communication because that's how much there is not a doer. Do you understand what I mean?
I completely hear what you're saying. And what this reminds me of is in the Avatar discourses, and this is a question that comes up, is there are descriptions of the native state of being, which the ego cannot comprehend because it isn't, the devotee has not yet fully matured in that realization. But there is an intuition, and there is the recognition of what he describes his experience to be in his state of being. And so he would say, not the doer, I am not thinking. I do not cause. I am merely present. The paradox of that in relationship to what you're describing in terms of how he functioned. Okay, that is enough to stop the mind and the body bows down because it's yielded and it's stopped in its tracks because it can't, the egoic motion or the force of the seeker is halted in that crazy wisdom observation of an incredible paradox that this person's communicating. The ability to go with or trust that process has to do with the heart, and the availability to be able to understand and inspect and consider and to participate in the core of that process with such veracity that it becomes clear what is being stated, that it is the bright itself speaking in and as a realizer. It's ecstatic speech. And in the bhava and in the actual position of the self position, it is unqualified. There are no perturbations. There are no modifications. And so speech is not caused. Shout is not caused. His presence is not caused. Thinking is not happening. In the bhava, the absolute nature of being itself, which is true of everyone and everything, that is the source condition. We would sit in silence and the mind dissolves in that. That's the stillness where no action occurs. But that's the sixth stage, the beginning. It's not even the segue to the seventh. You see, that's an error of dissociative abstraction in relationship to the causal knot. That's not even attention being resolved in its source in terms of the force of his descent and transmission, and the way the samadhi of the thumbs and then his presence works in relationship to the self position and the Atmanadi Shakti yoga. So his realization is that of open eyes, sahaja samadhi. So it's actionless action, which is not strategically motivated, and it's not caused by the ego act, where attention is bound to motion.
By rules.
Right. So all of the any sacred, something that is truly sacred, other words, set apart, is done through occurs through recognition, response of the state of being, and then the mover, the actual shakti, or the inherent energy, is the one that moves the devotee. Doesn't move the ego. The ego creates by virtue of identification and the recoil of identification with gross, subtle, and causal, subtle, and gross. It works simultaneously, synchronously, both ways. It works up and down in the chakras. It's all a synchronicity of all of these forces converging and happening and creating the perturbations and the mutations and all of the form that manifests as the she, that incredible force of nature. Wow. As we feel in the satsang with him, the state of being, of the stillness and the fullness and the absolute unmovable certainty of being itself is the resting place. That's the satsang, that is the source, that is the heart of being, that is him, that is his transmission. And from that, then the heart is moved, free energy and attention moves, and all the characteristics of this persona and body mind are animated in direct relationship in the context of being itself, him, as we call, not him as an other, but as Siddha Guru of this transmission of the bright, we live and move and are moved to manifest, and it always requires a response, a reciprocation as a lover, receiving the force and responding, moving and creating spontaneously, as I was describing early, and unique to each individual, as he described, is the way that we learn to dance as the Krishna, mythology. So there's a lot of mythologies associated with the gross, subtle, and causal aspects of the persona. And a lot of what you're describing in terms of the manner in which devotees are still defining the culture or defining Adidam are still dramatizations where enough energy and attention has not been freed enough in the responsive recognition response, so that the culture is being defined by these limits still. The tragedy is the defense and the protectiveness relative to wanting to cement that in its limited form as this is the fait accompli.
Yeah.
Now, I know now devotees know that's not true. Even the ones who are taking the form of functional roles and responsibilities, there is an aspect of, I can't, I refuse to accept that this is the fate. It's not sufficient. It isn't the fait accompli. It's not attractive to the world. The mission isn't happening. All sorts of things are falling way short. I mean, I can hear it shout. I hear it and I feel the frustration. I feel the sorrow, the despair, the appropriate emotions, even anger, in response to the complacency, the unwillingness of the culture as a body as a whole, which is the beginning. And you refer to Sutra 44 in the Dawn Horse Testament. This and what you're speaking about relative to what right action is, what right life is. It doesn't have to do with codes and rules. All of those things are fruitful, useful, and necessary. It doesn't have to do with formalities in that regard.
No,
the right form.
They are simply a mechanism of recording this constant feedback mechanism that Beloved was doing within himself. Constant.
Yes.
They're just means of that constant process of telemetry, if you will. If you don't write it
accountability.
down.
Accountability.
If you don't write it down, if you don't communicate it, if you don't even have a means to communicate about it, you may be way off. But if you can't even communicate that you're way off, you're not going to get,
Yeah. Well, this goes back to
shut you down and kick you out, and that's it. I mean, really?
Yeah. No. See, these limits are popping out, and it's like pimples are bursting, boils bursting all over the place. So much is being shoved in the closet of unhandled business that it's. I think I've used the words. It's embarrassing. I can like being in the room and hearing him shouting. You asked about earlier, feeling the force of his passion, and that was because of the seriousness of his and the fervor of the certainty of the unqualified nature and the inability to compromise in relationship to his devotees awakening. He wasn't going to say, okay, this is sufficient if it wasn't. And particularly when his years went by and the shout got louder and it got longer for longer periods of time, and certain individuals were able to stay there longer, it doesn't have to do with them being chosen. It didn't have to do with any individuals being chosen. No one was chosen. What manifested as a right and true function occurred by virtue of demonstration and proof. The process itself proving itself in the context of an individual's direct relationship, not only with Beloved, but what he kept calling for is the culture of accountability, what you're describing. So every aspect of the being is observed, understood. We consider this with one another, no problem, no praise, no blame, no scapegoating, just freely open consideration. That's what he taught. You see, and what would be most upsetting to him, and when he would shout the loudest, and I got this sometimes, you're stopping the process. You can't stop the process. Stay with me, stay with me. Don't do that. You can't stop the process. This isn't sufficient. Stay with me, stay with me.
Yeah.
As a lover, an incredibly impassioned lover of truth itself, reality itself, for the unleashing of bound energy and attention that creates the horror of what the ego act does. And it manifests primarily as dissonance, conflict, divisiveness, ostracizing people, ignoring people, shutting people down. All of the signs that we're seeing that so many people are going, whoa, not it. you see, if the motion of what the culture is manifesting continues, it's a self-sabotage. It's sabotaging beloved's work. And also, it's still unhandled business. It's still lack of sufficient self-understanding. So presumptions of advancement simply have to do with taking various experiential phenomena associated with all the first 6 stages of life, of which we have all had plenty of by virtue of his siddhis of coinciding. Why? The vast numbers of people that came into his company that had all these aspects of the structural mechanism through time and space, repetitiveness, life and birth, and the motion of universal possibilities, we all represented all of these experiences, gross, subtle, and causal. And some of those who were around him were able to take the shout, even dug it, as sadomasochists. I mean, I have to speak plainly about the liabilities and the virtues of individuals who gave him the material or the fuel for the fire of his outshining brightness. And so you have at the end time, so to speak, people are positioned in certain ways in the mandala that exists that does not require formal acknowledgement. He was speaking and working with everyone and everything. The formalities are secondary. They are not primary. And the vow, as Adidam indicated, joke's on you. Vow cannot be broken. Vow is eternal. This recognition response that occurred that established this relationship cannot be broken. But the shout was about the fact that the ego act is always modifying it, interfering with it, taking it, stealing it, revising it, turning it into something that is not, and wanting to establish the power structures of egoity, social egoity, political egoity, emotional sexual egoity, the cult of pairs egoity, the cult, which is what makes Adidam unattractive in the world. Why? It's functioning and seen in the world as a cult. Not because of Adidam not being a true guru. He spent more time than any other realizer criticizing in advance, acknowledging you will relate to me as a cult, because that's what the ego does.
Yeah.
So I'm just explaining, and there are characters in this play and on this stage that we can identify who are have certain characteristics, you know, and just to be very plain, Adidam said to Chandrasukapur, you will play the queen and you will play the martyr. You will ostracize everyone except for those who you choose to be your court. These are all very, very specific things that he said to her. The reason why it's necessary for me to say this isn't out of lack of love. I'm saying this because I need to reflect the culture as a whole, and you're asking the question, well, how do we make sense of this? Well, I'm trying to serve an understanding that any of the thousands that beloved worked with, and his confession, he was working with all through anyone who happened to come into his sphere spontaneously. There are a fewer even than thousands, there are hundreds, and then you even can get down to the 10s and 20s that he worked with very intimately, that his shout was about the fact that we were stopping and not continuing on with the process, and that's what brought his bodily incarnation to an end, because the force was not being received. His shout wasn't even being made right use of. That's why he was shouting louder and louder. And one of the things he also said about his force and his shout and the fire itself, it can be purifying, but only if it releases energy and attention, and there is insight that comes about, like there's self-understanding that allows you to change your act. There's a change of action, which then becomes actionless, motiveless, egoless response. That does not define the culture presently in relationship to those who are in positions of responsibility or functional roles. It doesn't describe those who are allowing it to happen, because if we truly cared and were in fidelity to beloved, we would serve with the kind of fervor that he demonstrated was necessary to hold one another accountable. He was not responsible for the accountability part. The husbanding force of his being is his state of being, his merely being present, and his bodily human form manifesting through the treasures that he manifested. The burden falls on all of us as a collective body. That's the mandala that was required, and that is a lot of people. And those are the orders, which we can also speak about sometime in terms of how it wasn't supposed to be an order of one.
Yeah.
And he also said there wasn't an RSO. He never acknowledged an RSO. And there was an office that he said would function in relationship to the RSO, which the office is supposed to be subordinate to the functional office. It's been flipped the other way around. See, there's so many revisions that have been made. Why? Because the dynamic, as he addressed it at the end of his life, would take a certain shape. And that shaping is shifting, shifting and shaping, shifting and shaping, and repeating the very errors that he said, beware of, beware of, beware of. And now what you're saying is it's even become taboo to address that. This is the dark time.
Mm-hmm. Well, my confession is that I wasn't even intending to address it, but I was speaking from that spontaneous place, no mind, devotional confession of beloved about something that had nothing to do with, trying to counter what they have set up as, the modus operandi, including explicit rules to be followed, all of that completely evaporated in the moment of communion with beloved. And I was just speaking openly out of that devotional recognition of fidelity to him. And for that reason, I am no longer allowed to be a devotee in Adidam. I mean, that is like.
Well, I will say in no uncertain terms, that is a tragedy. It's and I know the emotion that you feel about it. Psychophysically, it is harmful. And I will go so far as saying it's abusive. There are so many devotees, including myself, who should be participating in direct free relationship to all of his treasures, access to the sanctuaries, without a presumptuousness of this divisiveness of some being in greater levels of maturity. There aren't the signs that that's actually has integrity at this point. And so you're being dismissed by people who are having delusional presumptions of advancement. And it's just flat old true. And yes, there might be some who have his history that could be of use. If we were doing what you were describing, and observe how beloved lived. He was utterly transparent and available to be in relationship to those who are necessary to serve and help his process. We need to be served and helped in a transparent way, in love with one another, to enable that process, not the cutting off, not the taboos, not being slapped on whether or not you wave the incense a certain numbers of times or wear the right costume. Or say the right thing. I mean, it's even going so far as there are more vows added on to the eternal vow that you have to agree to completely respect that which should not be respected in terms of the manner in which it's functioning at the present time. That's why I find myself like you, ostracized, because I'm saying I cannot say that I will be subjugated to the extension of authority or his force, because I know, just as you have communicated and hundreds of others have communicated, and the world itself is reflecting by our lack of attractiveness, not actually demonstrating the radiance and the brilliance of instrumentality, that this is not it. This is not it. And that's not a punishment, not shame on you. it's like the shout serves the purpose of insight. The reflection serves the purpose of insight for radical self-understanding, self-observation. It's not case, it's not social, it's not about self-watching, as he described, which is the same word as case. It's not meditating on and rehearsing and just, not being able to, like, speaking about yourself over and over and over again endlessly. No, that kind of self-reflection is fruitless. What I'm speaking about is how he taught us about real self-observation, self-understanding, no taboos in terms of communication, and being able to no reaction in relationship to how the psychophysical person may arise. But there's a big distinction between that and actual abstraction. Can't talk about it, but you can dramatize it, which is what's happening now. It's not being addressed because there is a traumatic, like a trauma of dissociation in relationship to the horror of what the ego act creates and the implications. And Beloved's shout was reflecting that. You see, so do you get caught in the shout and feel guilty and feel shame and feel like, no, you're wrong, I have to prove it differently? No, that's not how it works. It's just not how it works. And I can only keep communicating it from how I have received his shout and received his love and force in so many different ways. If you can't receive the force of his shout, you cannot receive his love bliss, because the mechanism is limited. However, the force has to be done from a process of self-understanding and maturity, so it doesn't come across as creating conflict, abuse, or divisiveness. It actually enables an infinite number of beings to be conducted in the mandala. And as Adidam indicated, that maturity would be signed by the ability of prior unity manifesting humanly in action.